everybody, welcome back to Reissued. If you're new here, my name is Andrew. You may remember that a couple months back I DIY'd the Yeezy Balenciaga denim jacket with all the pads on it, and I love that video, I love that project. A lot of you love that video and that project too. I got a lot of comments like, make me a jacket like that, and my response was, no, it's way too much work. But I got a comment on that video last week asking if I had a PDF pattern with all of the pad shapes that I drew out. And at the time I did not, but today I do. So this week I have been busy tracing each pattern piece and trying to label them in a way that will make sense. It's not a perfect system. Everything is kind of hand-drawn and handwritten, so hopefully you can read my handwriting and understand the concepts. But I thought that I would put some of those patterns in action today and do kind of a like pared down version of the jacket on some tank tops because it's hot in Georgia. I think one of the most satisfying parts of that jacket is all of the little pads, and that was the easiest and most fun part, was the ironing on and sewing around each pad. So I thought, is there a way that I can kind of simplify and get that part going but avoid all of the like lining the jacket, dyeing the jacket part that was kind of fussy and crazy, right? So the hope is that we'll make something really cool that's maybe a little bit more DIY friendly, and it's possible that you can use some of the techniques that I'm using today on a jacket like the one I did before to maybe kind of simplify that process a little bit if you're still going for that look. I'll kind of explain that as we go. So we're gonna be embellishing two muscle shirts today, one I had on hand, one I thrifted. We're gonna be doing the actual pad technique inside one of those. And then the other one, we're gonna be doing a pleather applique that's gonna go on top. That's an even easier process. So let's get started. So in the early pre-days of my channel, I was on lockdown on my apartment in New York back when that was a thing. And I got out my sewing machine because I had some time on my hands for the first time in a while, and I made some stuff. So one of the things that I made was this kind of tank top thing with these armor inspired pads on the front. This pattern was actually inspired by the very first pleather jacket that I ever had in college. It was a Zara jacket with all of this really cool padded stuff on it. I wish I still had that. It started to peel because it was not real leather, but it was such a cool piece. And so I thought I would kind of like pay homage to that a little bit in this piece. So included in the pattern, which I am gonna link on my website, I have the Yeezy jacket pattern armor pieces, and then I'm adding this one as well. You know, maybe these can work for you too. Materials roll call here. For this armor tank, this is like a black Nike kind of like b-ball muscle tank, very kind of like Y2K that I got at Goodwill. I'm gonna be embellishing that with this white pleather, which is the same that I used on the mesh on the original piece. I don't know how much of it I have, so we're gonna make it work with what we have. This is the PDF pattern. And then I picked up some Wonder Under, which is a really thin, double-sided fusible interfacing that's gonna help us kind of place the pieces and get them to stay while we sew them on. And then for the padded tank, I have this Lululemon tank that I've had for years, and I don't really love it all that much. I have this 1/4 inch double-sided fusible foam interfacing that I used on the Yeezy jacket. I have some left over. I have a very similar weight and kind of stretch amount to my tank. This is what we're gonna use as the kind of lining, if you will, on the other side of the foam. And then of course I have my wonderful PDF pattern here. So exciting. First, I wanted to iron on the Wonder Under fusible net onto my faux leather. This faux leather is from the Scrap Exchange in Durham, North Carolina, where I used to shop for fabrics quite often. A lot of furniture is manufactured in North Carolina, so they often had upholstery offcuts like this. So this vinyl is super thick and heavy duty. I knew that I would need to cover as much of this as possible to get all of my pieces cut out, so I worked in sections to get all the Wonder Under attached, being careful not to fuse it to my ironing board. I think it's a good idea before we trace or cut out any pieces with these patterns to sort of put the patterns on the garment and get a sense of how everything's gonna fit together. I know on this armor jacket that the shoulder panels are gonna be way too big for the cut of this tank top, and so I would rather cut those down before I actually cut it out of the fabric, right? So you can see here that the end of the sleeve comes way before the end of this pattern piece. Also, the curve of the collar may or may not match this curve that I have here. So whatever the curve of your collar piece is here, we want to come right in along there. So I'm going to probably trim this one down a little bit, which is good because I don't have that much fabric. I put the shirt on my form to adjust the pattern just for ease. I also could have done this by laying the shoulder seam out as flat as possible. So I'm not a pattern maker, and I don't honestly sew with the pattern that often, so I'm not very aware of all of the terms, but did the best I could. I'll try to explain anything as I go, just so we're on the same page. So anywhere that I have the word top with an arrow, that is the top of the piece, and it's meant to kind of go like straight up and down, right? So it's kind of like a vertical line. That's the vertical line going up. Of course, everything is really subjective with these patterns, so you do what you think looks good, but this was sort of my idea when I made the pattern. Now I trace my pieces onto the paper backing. For both the armor tank pattern and the Yeezy Jacket pattern, I provided the pieces for one side, the left side in this case, so you just need to flip the patterns over to the wrong side to trace the pieces for the opposite side. Since I wasn't able to lay everything out all at once, I ended up having to rearrange and retrace some of my pieces to fit them all. I had just enough fabric for this, which was honestly kind of satisfying. It feels good to use something up entirely and not have random scraps hanging around. Let's cut these out. I switched to my super sharp and sacred fabric only scissors for this part. Now on to ironing. I peeled the backing paper off one of the shoulder pieces, lined up the collar curves, placed some wax paper over the top, and pressed down with my iron on a wool setting. The instructions didn't specify a heat setting, and I didn't want to go too hot and damage my faux leather, so this was a safe middle ground. And it didn't work at all. Then I tried taping the pieces on and ironing from the underside since the jersey was thinner and might heat up more easily. So the Wonder Under appears to not be sticking to the jersey as well as I hoped it would. Maybe my iron isn't hot enough, but I don't really want to take any chances on melting my faux leather, especially since I barely had enough for this. So I think that I'm going to keep my tape in place, do the best I can, and then stitch it right away. And of course that'll hold it on, so no worries. I stopped midway through sewing to cut the curve more accurately to match the curve of the armhole. I'm glad I left a little extra in the pattern since I ended up needing that length on one end. But now we can make it match up exactly and finish up the seam around the edge. First shoulder is done, and I am beyond pumped about how it looks. Oh my god, I'm so excited. It's gonna be great. I repeat for the other shoulder and then tape all of the front pieces on. I felt it was best to see them all in place at the same time and give it a try on to ensure the placement was right. I started to iron from the wrong side with zero success. Then I realized that I forgot to peel off the backing paper. Duh. And with the backing paper off, it still wasn't sticking to the jersey very well. So I pressed on and left the tape, only moving it when I needed to sew over those areas. This method honestly worked pretty well. As I sew, I'm lining up the edge of the faux leather with the inside edge of my presser foot to get a pretty even seam allowance. After each seam, I pull my end threads to the inside of the garment to tie them off. This just makes it look cleaner from the outside. Alright y'all, I'm going to finish up the rest of this off camera, partly because I think you get the gist, and partly because I will be a lot more calm if I'm not being filmed while sewing. Two thoughts here before I sign off. One, don't waste your time with the Wonder Under. It apparently does not stick to jersey, or at least this jersey. I'm really hoping that the other interfacing sticks to the other jersey for the other project, or else I'm screwed. But this one, I mean, it literally did nothing. So that's frustrating. And then thought number two, when you're feeling tired and over it, take a break, don't power through. I'm in that place where I'm like trying to get everything done and I'm powering through, and then I just literally cut a hole in the shirt. I sewed it back up, everything's fine, but baby needs a break. So PSA here, when you need a break, take a break. All right, we're back for day 2. First tank is done. Moving on to the second one. I decided that nothing is gonna get me excited about this gray tank top. I was kidding myself. So we're gonna switch it up. I'm gonna do a white t-shirt instead. I had these 2 white Hanes t-shirts lying around the house, so I'm gonna cut off the sleeves. I think that'll be a cool contrast with the like intricate padding and then the kind of grungy cut off sleeve. And I was gonna use the white t-shirt for the lining anyway, so that just makes sense. I'm excited about it, let's do it.
I cut off the sleeves by laying the shirt super flat and cutting off just inside the sleeve seam and about 3 inches down below the armhole. When cutting a shirt like this, I always keep in mind that the hole will end up a little bit larger once the fabric rolls in slightly. With my shirt cut down, I pulled out my PDF pattern and started choosing which pieces to use. I followed the general placement of where the pieces were on the Yeezy Jacket, but I eliminated a few and cut some down to fit better.
So as I mentioned before, these pieces can be kind of like cut down, adjusted depending on the garment you're putting on and your personal choice. So on the front, I'm choosing these 2 pieces here. I cut this one down to fit across the width of the shoulder. And then over here, same thing, this guy got cut down to fit on the width of the shoulder. Piece 1 and 2, it's gonna be repeated right here. And I think that's just gonna be a nice little like more minimal approach rather than doing the whole thing down the back here. And so now we can trace these pieces onto the foam and cut them out.
One of these days, I'm going to invest in a real deal fabric marker that draws on easily and erases with water or air or something. But for today, we are painstakingly scratching on the outlines with pencil. I'm just tracing whichever piece seems to fit best to minimize waste. And with all my pieces cut, I now trace the shapes on the shirt in the placement that looks right. This will help me place the pads and serve as a sewing guideline when I sew around them. Now I follow the technique that I used in the Yeezy Jacket. I place the pads under the shirt, ideally on top of some wax paper, unlike I'm doing here. Line up the edges of the pad with my drawn line by feeling around the edges, and then press it down with my iron on the wool setting with lots of steam. This setting was specified in the fusible instructions and worked perfectly. Even though it's sometimes a better idea to only do a few pieces at a time and then sew them right away, since the ironing method only sticks so well, I opted to attach all the pads at once this time. They were sticking very well to the jersey, and I felt like it would be easier with the way that I'm doing the lining.
So I got my pads in and the interfacing did stick pretty well, so that's a relief. However, as we know, it's not going to stick totally permanently, like we need to be able to sew it in as well, so I need to have some type of lining on the inside so that I can sandwich the pads between those 2 pieces. And so the theory here is that I'm going to cut up this other t-shirt and put that behind, and then I'll be able to cut along the edge kind of the shapes because the jersey won't fray, right? When I did the denim jacket, I ended up having to open up all the seams so that I could put the lining pieces inside because I fully lined everything. But my theory is that if you were to put a jersey fabric behind or another fabric that doesn't fray, you could just iron the fabric behind, sew around, and then cut around the edge of each shape. So it wouldn't be fully lined, but it would still be padded, if that makes sense.
I cut the sleeves off the lining shirt, then flipped the outer shirt inside out. I slipped the outer shirt inside the lining shirt so that the shirts were wrong sides together with the foam pads in between. After lining up the shoulder seams and pinning those down, I keep everything smooth and flat while I iron the lining shirt to affix the pads. Then I turn it right side out so that I have my sewing lines easily visible. We're ready to sew. Now I just sew along the edge of each pad using the line I drew as a reference. Occasionally my pads didn't line up very well with these lines. In that case, I think it looks better to follow the shape of the pad rather than the line. If it looks like it was all smooth sailing, trust me, it was not. I had so many bobbin issues, tension issues. It was just a mess. But I left the camera off for those parts and took a couple breaks and powered through to stitch around all of the pads. Once the sewing was complete, I flipped the shirt inside out and very carefully cut the lining shirt only around the edges of my pads, starting at the front shoulder, working around the collar to the other shoulder, and then down the armhole and across the back. I took my time so as not to cut the wrong shirt. That would be such a bummer after all this work. And with that, the shirt is done. If you like this video, be sure to hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Also, be sure to check out my free PDF pattern on my website, reissued.store. And while you're there, check out some other things that I have for sale as well, including the original tank that this was inspired by. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.